Okay, this is about offender profiling. Now, this is the sort of thing that people really like, I think, when it comes to psychology. They assume that you've probably seen The Silence of the Lambs and uh, uh, Jodie, whatever her name is, attending the prison to speak to Anthony Hopkins, psychopath, who will help her to catch this serious offender by giving an incredibly accurate psychological profile. So people like the idea that it's possible to understand offenders and to see into their heads and see their motivations and agenda and thought processes, and thereby use that insight to catch them. So offender profiling is it's the basis for a lot of drama, and it is a it's a particular view of what's possible that when I see that there's a video we'll watch, and there's an academic called David Cantor, a British profiler, and when Cantor talks, it's like a tremendous weight has been lifted off my chest. It's as if the world has suddenly become sane again, because too much of offender profiling is just basically bad philosophy. And it involves a whole load of assumptions about what's possible, how the world works, what a human being is, about normal and abnormal psychology, what psychology can ever be as a discipline. It involves a whole range of things that somebody like me, limping forward into the 21st century from my 1980s education, a lot of psychology just strikes me as too glib by half, too lazy, just bad philosophy. And Cantor, as I say, is a breath of fresh air precisely because he takes a much more measured and moderate approach and a much more scientific approach. The irony about forensic psychology is that the people who seem less dynamic are in actual fact the ones who are probably closer to an appropriate approach that's consistent with best methodology and with a real transparency in your work. The I try and remember which novel it is with Morris Zapp. Morris Zapp, the American academic. I think it's a David Lodge. David Lodge, I think Philip Lodge, can't remember. There's a novel based on the clash, the culture clash between a British and an American academic, and it's very much part of British academic work, or it used to be, that you don't overpromise and that you're open about your methodology and that you don't allied over the distinction between a theorist and a theoretician. A theorist is somebody who's just interested in understanding. A theoretician is somebody who's like an engineer. They're interested in trying to use theory to change the world. And there's a big distinction between a theorist and a theoretician. Michael Oakeshott, the philosopher, drew this as the sort of fundamental distinction. And that's why he had, when he wrote a book in 1933 called Experience and Its Modes, and he had a mode of science and a mode of practice and a mode of history. And what he meant by that was you're born into the world and you can experience, I nearly said you can experience the world. Oakeshott's an idealist. So you don't experience the world because we don't know that there's a world out there. We don't really have the basis for realism. We don't know what exists. We only know what our experiences are. So our experiences are modal. In other words, you can choose to become a scientist, in which case you'll try to understand the world in terms of causative relationships, ultimately in terms of maths, ultimately in terms of number. Or you can understand the world practically. In other words, you can try to actually engage as a politician would, or an engineer, or someone like that, or a parent, I suppose. So these are different modal understandings. And from a British point of view, a lot of what passes for forensic psychology jumps over those divisions. It's too quick to run from a theoretical understanding to a supposed practical ability to change the world. And from a British point of view, it's disreputable. Cantor has obviously got a fair amount of contempt for a lot of what's done in the United States because he thinks that they're running before they can walk. They're representing as solid science what is in really something approaching astrology. So the as I say, offender profiling is the sort of attractive end of psychology, and it's important to not be seduced by the glossiness. So what is profiling? Profiling is basically looking at offences and trying to work out what must be true of offenders. So it's a bit like, for example, what you might have looked at in terms of organised and disorganised behaviour at a crime scene. If you look at a crime scene and it's got, for example, if the Israeli Secret Service kills people by shooting them in the head, because they've worked out that the one thing that people don't survive is being shot in the head. Bombs don't always kill people. Being shot in the torso frequently doesn't kill people, but head injuries are extremely serious. Something like 80% of all the fatal injuries are battlefield injuries to the head, which is why it makes no sense whatsoever for American police officers to wear a bullet-resistant jacket but not wear a helmet, because the one part of your body you absolutely can't have injured is your head. A tiny metal fragment going into your brain will kill you every time. There was a lunatic in Finland killed a whole load of people with a Walther target pistol. And the pistol was a 2.2 target pistol with no real energy, no real lethality. But he was shooting people in the head with it. And he killed, I can't remember, 13 people, 15 people by shooting them with this very low-powered little target pistol. But he was hitting them in the head, and that kills you nearly every time. So if you get a crime scene where someone's been shot with a 2.2 pistol from a distance, and there's no burn marks, there's no powder on them, so they were shot from some considerable distance, then you know that somebody who was quite cold and quite calculated and quite skillful shot them, and that tells you something about the offender. Jill Dando, the television presenter, was shot with a smooth bore pistol. In other words, a normal pistol, any rifle these days, has got rifling inside the barrel to spin the bullet to make it more stable so it'll be more accurate. And she was shot with a smooth bore pistol, and that indicated that it was a pistol that had been taken, probably a replica pistol or something similar, a gas pistol from the Czech Republic, and had been converted to fire a bullet. So that told them that somebody had used a fair amount of engineering skill to convert this pistol, but they didn't have access to other firearms. So you can look at a crime scene and try and infer characteristics of the offender. So, for example, the kids that are being killed in London with edged weapons are sometimes being killed with very large blades, and it doesn't take a psychologist to know that these are being carried by kids in gangs, rather than being small blades being carried for supposed self-protection by kids who are terrified of gangs. So if someone has been killed with some of these weapons, a police officer could tell you what's likely to be true just based on what we know about offenders. Now, what criminal profiling, offender profiling, tries to tell you is that people who've got psychological characteristics, like, for example, they're psychopaths and use other people all the time, or that they're seriously psychotically mentally ill, and that they're not fully in possession of their faculties and they're not able to navigate the world. These kinds of people produce characteristically different crime scenes. So offender profiling is about looking at the crime scene and trying to work out, for example, whether you're dealing with a psychopath or somebody who is psychotic. A psychopath has got a personality disorder. Personality disorders are not illnesses. They're just basic orientations to the world, in the same way that not having a personality disorder is an orientation to the world. And if you don't have a personality disorder, then you've got fundamental architecture in your head about how the world fits together and what your place is in it. But that architecture can be different. So if you are, for example, a narcissist, if you've got narcissistic personality disorder, you'll have characteristic ways of putting the world together. You will have, for example, a very high need for drama, and therefore you'll create circumstances and cause scenes in order to feel alive, because you've got an unstable sense of self. Because you don't have a stable sense of self, you have to create a scene in order to feel alive, because you're then the creator of that scene. Narcissists tend not to break the law, interestingly. Narcissists, as part of their mental architecture, have got a fear of being challenged by people who they can't manipulate, the authorities. So narcissists will tend to target folk in the workplace, where they can cause hell without breaking the law. A narcissist who's a personnel officer, human resources manager, is in a perfect position, because they can cause a lot of damage without actually breaking the criminal law. Police officers who've got narcissistic personality disorder are in a strong position to cause a lot of trouble. So if you look at crime scenes, the most obvious thing you can ask yourself when it comes to violent crime is this person a psychopath or is this person psychotic? Because they'll frequently be one or the other. and if they are a psychopath or a psychotic, they'll have produced a different kind of crime scene. So that's what offender profiling is. It's an attempt to look at a crime scene and work out what is true of the kind of offenders who produce that kind of crime scene. So Ainsworth in 2001 said, profiling means using the available information about a crime scene and a victim to compose a profile of the perpetrator. So for example, if somebody owns a taxi firm or is a prostitute, they're probably going to come into conflict with various kinds of people. Taxi firms are famous for being ways for criminals to launder money and also to make money. And therefore, if you own a taxi firm, then you might have come into conflict with criminals because of that. If you're a prostitute, then pimps and punters are the kind of people you might come into conflict with, as well as other prostitutes. So we know that just from basic policing principles. We know the kind of conflicts that arise. Offender profiling is much more about, for example, if somebody, if an older person is killed and killed with a tremendous amount of violence, the inky finger of suspicion might fall on somebody related to them who feels wronged by them. So it becomes relevant. A really disordered, violent crime scene where there's no obvious forced entry, but the person has been really badly beaten and the body's been disfigured after the person's dead. That tends to speak to somebody with a personal motive. Damaging a body after a person's dead is not a normal thing to do. So the person is either, distinctly disturbed, or alternatively, they've got a very, very powerful feeling of animus, an anger, a hatred of the person they've harmed. And you start thinking about, do they have any sons and daughters? And if they do any of them stand to inherit money or not inherit money? What's the distribution of funds? There's an old saying in the law, cui bono, who benefits? And that's an interesting question just in normal policing. But when it comes to, for example, a crime scene that shows a lot of anger, aggression, and violence directed towards the body of the victim, the question arises: who would be so angry with a person they would do something like this? And that, of course, is typically done. Damaging bodies after someone is dead is typically done by somebody who's got a special reason to hate the person they're doing it to, and that's characteristic of the crime scene. So it's somewhat like conventional detective work, but not quite, because conventional detective work is much more about, motives that you and I have got. There's an old a psychiatrist called Pincus said something like, "Bad men do what good men dream." The thing that stands between you and I, between each of us, and drug dealing or theft, is fear of getting caught and a belief that we can get by without it. If you thought you could do it without getting caught, you might do it. You might also not do it because you've got norms that stand in place. In other words, you value other people and you value their welfare, and you wouldn't want to do something that harmed them. So when cops are dealing with people, they're dealing with people who commit acquisitive crimes because, like theft, because they want the property. And we want property, which is why we work. So the motivation to steal and the motivation to work are in some ways the same motivation. When violent crimes take place, it's because sometimes a person's angry with somebody else. Like, for example, their son has been bullying your son. So their son bullies your son. You try to speak to them, they're cheeky to you, so you take your opportunity and you harm them. And a cop can work that out just based on what they would like to do in the same circumstances, but wouldn't do because they fear prosecution. I was watching that chap, Jonathan Pye, the actor, pretending to be a broadcast presenter, and Jonathan Pye says, every morning I would assault 4 people on the way to work. The only thing that stops me is the fear of arrest. So conventional detective work is based on understanding human motivations. If you can, I was thinking about this. This might sound like a silly question. You can't put broken Pyrex glassware in a bottle bank because it doesn't melt at the normal temperature, and they don't want to heat the bottle bank up to a ridiculous temperature beyond 400 degrees. So broken Pyrex can't go into bottle banks. Now, one of the things they have to do is try and sort out the Pyrex before the glass goes in. So what you do is you pay somebody to stand at a belt as it moves past, and they try and pick out any broken kitchenware. Now, I thought about how you would incentivise someone to do a really good job of that, which would be to pay them 50 pence for every 300 grams of Pyrex they manage to pick out, or whatever. And what you would do is every hour you would put 2 or 3 bits in to keep them interested, and they would pick them out and get extra money. And of course, my next thought was, how would I game that if I was the person picking them out? And the answer is, I would take broken Pyrex. I would take broken Pyrex into work, and I would put it on the belt so that I could then pick it out and get the money. So I would be selling the company broken Pyrex. There's an old story about a guy with a small shop who was selling butter in competition with the supermarket. And no matter how far the supermarket cut their prices, the little man managed to match the price. And eventually the supermarket gave up when they asked him where he was getting his butter from, and he said, "I buy it from you." So if you've got a reasonable degree of common sense, you can work out what somebody would do, and that's what conventional detective work involves. So profiling is a bit different because you're looking at people who've perhaps got something wrong with them. They're psychopathic, they're sociopathic, they're psychotic. So what is offender profiling? Profiling is about, it's distinctive. Does the offence suggest psychological characteristics? And what we mean by psychological characteristics are characteristics out with the norm that you would expect from a normal, violent or acquisitive crime. So most of us would lash out in anger if we were wronged, and most of us would want revenge if somebody wronged us, and most of us would like property without working. I certainly would. So those are not really the psychological characteristics we're talking about. We're talking about psychological characteristics that are to some degree deviant, like, for example, being psychotic or being a psychopath. Detectives think about who did it as opposed to what type of person. So they might think in terms of types of people, like, for example, 15, 16-year-olds. If somebody's been beaten up in the street, a gay person has been attacked in Kelvin Grove Park at 3 o'clock in the morning, the cops are going to be thinking a little bit about types, who would do such a thing. But they tend to think about who. The most obvious thing cops do with a serious offence is they work out who was close to the victim, because most people who are victims of serious offences is someone they know. So the cops instantly think, right, okay, who I mean, take for example, there was a vet, the wife of a dentist, killed herself in Glasgow a few years ago by giving herself drugs and then setting fire to the conservatory in which she was sitting. Now, as soon as somebody does something as dramatic as that, the cops are instantly thinking, who stands to benefit from our life insurance? Who stands to benefit from her not being around? So the cops tend to think about, as I've said before, cui bono, who benefits. If they can't find somebody who benefits, then they might be driven to think what type of person would do such a thing. So Moira Jones gets killed in Queen's Park, and the first thing the cops do is they get hold of her boyfriend, who she was with the night before. And you can be absolutely certain that they're looking at his hands, looking at his feet, looking at his shins, looking at his face, if there's any marks on him, getting his clothing, getting into his house. Excuse me, sir, do you mind if we come in? And of course, if you say no, they're going to force entry because they're going to be very suspicious. They want to see what's in your washing machine, they want to see what's in your laundry basket, they want to see your sheets and see whether there's any blood from your shins or hands in the sheets. So the first thing they do is they think, who's around you who could have done this? And then once they haven't got that, they might start thinking about what kind of person would do this kind of thing. And if it's an extraordinary crime, then they're thinking, what kind of extraordinary person could have done this? So profiling is not really about the who. So there was a guy in the West End called, his surname was Blue. What's his first name? But the guy owned a taxi firm, and he was beaten to death outside his house. The question mark was, why was he killed? And the first thing the cops arrived at was almost certainly because of the taxi firm. So they then have a go at trying to find a local Glasgow taxi firm where somebody was involved in beating him to death. Once they give up on that, then it's, as I say, a question about characteristics. Who would have done such a thing? And this kind of disinhibited punching and kicking attack that killed him. And I contacted the cops and I said, you realise there's a a resettlement centre for people who've been convicted, not 100 yards away, and you realise that Blue was, Alex Blue, I think his name was, you realise that Blue was driving a Porsche 911 from the West End up into Downhill. So if he had an interaction with some kids who were in rehabilitation, resettlement from prison, which is only 100 yards away, one of them might be the kind of person who would completely lose it and engage in a kind of kicking and punching attack, which is going to result in them being convicted if they get caught or even questioned, because they're going to be covered in bruises. So I suggested to them that they were jumping to conclusions and they were assuming it had to be connected to the taxi business. And I think it caused them to think, because we haven't been able to find anybody who did this. It doesn't look like the kind of crime that should have resulted from the taxi business. So, as I say, predictions about likely characteristics, what kind of person would have done this. And that's a very different thing from, round up the usual suspects. If you get murdered, all your pals and all your relatives are going to be the first point of call for the cops, because probably one of them did it. So what does it allow? Profiling allows you to target an investigation. Investigations are extremely expensive and they involve huge numbers of people. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation in the north of England, which was just before I moved to Leeds, it cost an absolute fortune. Some of these major investigations cost tens of millions of pounds. If they go on long enough, they could cost even more than that. So you're talking about a huge amount of money. So you want to target an investigation and prioritise people. If you can find out who did it, you can stop worrying about all the people who could have done it. So finding out who definitely did it saves you a lot of money, because running through every single person who could possibly have done it in order to eliminate them is a very expensive way to go about it. So if you can find somebody fairly quickly, or find at least half a dozen, one of whom probably did it, then you can stop a lot of investigatory time being wasted. So the Mad Bomber in New York, the first documented case. This is quite famous, and we'll watch some video on it. May 1951. Now this is late on in the campaign. A homemade bomb in Grand Central Station, massive central station in New York City. There was 5 more found in the coming months, and the offender was dubbed the Mad Bomber, because there didn't seem to be any rhyme, reason or rationale. Now it turned out there was a rationale, there was a reason why he was doing it, and the bombing had begun much earlier. The first event was in 1940, a pipe bomb. Now what is a pipe bomb? A pipe bomb is a very crude device. If you can't make high explosive, what you can do is confine low explosive in a pipe, and the pipe will rupture and it'll cause a bang. Now there won't be much energy behind this. The pipe will probably rupture in one place with a seam split. So what you'll get is a lot of hot gas coming out of that seam split, but that's not going to do much damage. So pipe bombs are, stupid devices. They used to be made with weed killer, sodium chlorate weed killer, which has now got lower levels of chemical oxygen in it. My old pal Griff, who died a few years ago, Griff was in the habit of making his own fireworks from soaking paper in sodium chlorate weed killer and then drying it out and then lighting it in a copper tube in the garden to make bangers. Thank God I wasn't there. All his pals were around to have salad and burgers and steaks on November the 5th. And Griff decided, instead of using a little tiny bit of paper, to use most of a sheet of paper in the copper tube. The bang could be heard for miles all round the village of Carmunnick, and he deafened his mates. None of his mates could hear, and they all went home, and he was left with all the burgers and the salad. So a pipe bomb is just some kind of low explosive contained in a pipe, like a banger. And the note read, Con Edison, which is an energy company, Con Edison are crooks, this is for you. Now, of course, right away, if you were a detective, you would be thinking, well, who's been wronged by Con Edison? Who's been wronged by the company? And it's probably not somebody who's just been overcharged on a bill, because this looks like somebody who's been sufficiently angered to do something pretty dramatic. So you would be thinking an employee. More bombs were detected in 41. The offender sent a note, no more bombs for the duration of the war. Now again, if you're a detective or indeed a psychologist, you're thinking, this is somebody who's rational, and this is somebody who's fairly patriotic. This is somebody who's got a set of norms. This is somebody who's got beliefs in place. Anyone that's not prepared to bomb their own country during the war because it would be disruptive, that's somebody that's still got a normative framework. That's somebody who cares about something other than himself. He also said, that Con Ed, the electricity utility, would be brought to justice. Now, of course, yeah, again, your suspicion has to be this is a wronged former employee. So the patriotic bomber was good as his word. He didn't plant any bombs during the war and then resumed after the war. The threats in the press continued, however. In 1951, we had the shenanigans talked about. Then we had the Radio City Music Hall bomb in 54, and then 55 further bombs, Grand Central Station, Macy's, the RCA building, the Staten Island Ferry. So this is a pattern of bombs all around the area. One of the things right away, when we look at Cantor later on, Cantor would have looked at the pattern and said, how is the person doing this in terms of the urban environment? How are they moving through the urban environment? Cantor essentially says that offenders move through the urban environment rationally in the way that anybody else does. So if you're trying to get from, for example, Cardonald College to the Langside, you're probably going to walk through the big park at Pollock Park because it's the most direct route. You might not, but you might well. And as I say, that moving through the urban environment, if it was late in the day, you probably wouldn't, because you would be concerned about being in a park on your own late at night, perhaps. So, a rational person, even if they're a criminal, moves through the urban environment in certain predictable ways. So, looking at the distribution of these bombs and then drawing a line to where the bombs intersect, you can probably find out where the person lives. There's been some really uncanny predictions done on that basis, just by looking at, assuming the person radiates out from their home like the spokes of a wheel, you draw all the crimes on a map, and then you take away any major barrier, like, for example, a canal or a major road or anything like that. So ignore that and pretend that actually is a major barrier that can't be crossed. So if a crime has been committed beyond that barrier, rule that one out, because that's an unusual thing to do. It might have been done for a particular reason. So if you draw those spokes back in, you can sometimes find the pretty much exact location of the person who's marauding outwards. Anyway, this particular guy, as I say, was committing all these offences around the area. The cops drew a blank. It was a Con Ed investigator, a secretary, I think, who found him, going through the employment records, because they recognised something in the writing of the letters to the papers, and then recognised that as being similar to complaints they'd had from the former employee. So, Metesky, George Peter Metesky, a disgruntled ex-employee. He had an accident in 31, and he made his claim too late. I checked the details. It was amazing. If he'd made the claim in the first 6 months, he could have got a pension out of them. But he delayed it too long and then couldn't get disability benefits. Just as an aside, the United States is a funny country in lots of ways. You'll be amazed at the number of people in the US who manage to avoid being the desperate poor through various mechanisms. So, for example, military pensions and police pensions and similar things, local authority pensions. A lot of American local authorities would pay out 2% of your wages for every year served at 55. That's amazing. You do 30 years, you can get 60% of your wages at the age of 55. And people wonder why the United States is drowning in debt, federal debt and state and local debt. This is why. This is one of the things the UK has to do as well, try and get a grip of this. So even in the 1930s, this guy could have got a pension, could have got disability benefits out of Con Ed if he'd put in his claim, but he didn't. Metesky was mild-mannered, he lived with his sisters. He was sent to a mental institution and released in 1973. Now, an offender profile had been drawn up with him, for him, and it was remarkably accurate. James Brussel had drawn a profile, and Brussel, as I say, had been involved in the military during the Second World War. So he said it would be a white male, 40 to 50s, lives with his aunt or his sister, hates his father, loves his mother, and he will be wearing a double-breasted suit when apprehended. Now, you can watch the video. If you stop and think about it, this isn't as impressive as you'd think. Most offenders are male. So saying it's going to be a male is not particularly a good trick. Saying it's going to be the person's going to be white in New York is not a particularly good trick because the majority are, and more importantly, there'd be more suspicion probably over lots of the locations. If it had been an African American in the location, they would have attracted more attention. So any rational, and you don't necessarily have to be thinking out, explicitly. The psychiatrist might not know how he knows this. When the psychiatrist says it'll probably be somebody male and white, he probably doesn't think self-consciously, I'm going to con these people, because it'll almost certainly be a male because offenders are male, and most of the people employed in Con Ed or similar companies are going to be male. And they're probably going to be white because they couldn't have moved around all these locations without attracting more suspicion if they hadn't been white. They won't be thinking this consciously, but that's the sort of reasoning that goes on at the back of your mind without you realising. He's probably going to be in his 40s or 50s because of the sheer amount of offending. This kind of offending wouldn't have taken place early on in the 40s and then continued. Remember, we're talking about offending continuing over a decade and a half or more. So in order for you to be an offender, you're going to have to be a certain age. You're probably not going to be a schoolboy. And in order for you to, therefore, to be offending over that period of time, there's a likely age that you'll be. So some of these things can just be worked out from common sense. African Americans would find it harder to move through the urban environment. These kinds of offences are probably not going to be committed by a very young person, and therefore if they were committed by a person who was of a reasonable age when they started, they have to be middle-aged now, and so on. And they're probably more likely to be male just because males commit more offences. So there's Metesky in his double-breasted buttoned suit. I wonder if the cops asked him to button it so that it would fulfil the prediction. I'm glad I did it, said the bomber. That face through the bars there does not look to me entirely reassuring. It's particularly the smile, which looks as if it's been photoshopped on from a happier man. But anyway, so there's the mad bomber in his double-breasted suit. Now, moving forward, the father of profiling, right? This is John Douglas. Now, this is the FBI, the modern FBI, really revolutionising the very idea and inventing the idea that has been taken on in these movies like the Silence of the Lambs type movies. And the one that was the first movie in that series, which didn't have Anthony Hopkins in it, was called Manhunter, I think it was called. So Douglas is the inspiration for that kind of thing. 25 years with the FBI, the Investigative Support Unit, dealing with very serious offences and trying to support the federal cops. He developed these profiling techniques now taught in the Behavioural Science Unit, which was recently reformed in the last, I think, few years. So the FBI were pioneers in this behavioural science of prediction. He was consulted on the Atlanta child murders and on other murders as well, including the Unabomber. We'll look at them later on. The Unabomber was an interesting case because, again, he was caught. He was making really quite sophisticated little bombs, anti-personnel bombs, actually. What the Unabomber was doing was he was taking wood and he was putting 12-gauge shotgun shells into pipes to make a primitive barrel. And then he was putting 4 of them in a square so that whichever way you were holding it, you were going to shoot yourself. I think there was probably one particular angle where you could just about manage to miss yourself with both barrels, or all 4 barrels. I'm just thinking in my head whether that's true. It was a shape almost like a swastika. And he'd worked out that whichever way you were holding this package, you would probably shoot yourself with the 12-gauge shotgun shell. And he was making these out of wood and springs and so on. So it was really quite ingenious, and he was writing mad, extended diatribes. And what got him caught eventually was, I think it was his brother, recognised the style. So he released this big manifesto, and the brother recognised the style. So the Unabomber was actually caught in the same way that Metesky was caught, by somebody recognising the style. This will make you laugh. I went out, my friend became a police officer. I went out to do my laundry one night, and I came back and my friend said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Doing my laundry." And he goes, "Oh, aye. So if I looked in that bag, I would find hot laundry, would I?" And I went, "Yes." "I see. So you didn't go anywhere else then, did you?" And I went, "No." And it turned out there'd been a flasher. Somebody had been running about, flashing, and the neighbours had been round. And he said, the thing that made him suspicious was the description that the person had unusually long legs in proportion to his overall height. And my mate, who would become a cop, he said that was the thing that did it for me. You know what I mean? He said I was standing at the door and I went, oh my God, you know. So anyway, he admitted that I had in actual fact been in the Glasgow University Union eventually doing my laundry, but he was made suspicious. So most of these people are caught not because of some wonderful profiling technique. They're caught because somebody who knows them hears a piece of information and thinks, "Oh dear, I think I know who that is." There was a guy who was assaulting folk all the way through Glasgow, and I phoned the cops because I thought I recognised him from the college. And as soon as I said that, the cop said, "No, it's all right. We already know who he is." So other people had phoned up because they recognised him. So this type of profiling is known as top-down profiling. And what that means, you'll understand what that means when you see the British alternative, which is bottom-up. So top-down profiling makes the claim about types of personality. There are types of personality, and those types of personality drive crime scenes. They produce crime scenes. The British so-called bottom-up profiling. Now, these terms are misleading because the British bottom-up profiling does involve claims about boldness and what happens over time to offenders. But the fundamental distinction is the Americans think there are types of people, like, for example, psychopaths and psychotic people who commit offences that are organised and disorganised. The British Cantor bottom-up process is much more about working out from the distribution of the offences and the types of offences, what kind of journey had to be taken by the offender and where the offender is likely to be. So it's much more about urban geography. So the Americans are concerned with persons, we're concerned with place. So what to look for? Look for the condition of the crime scene. This will give you clues. So for example, if there's a huge amount of force being used, you can probably rule out very elderly offenders. And again, reason tells you that. But also as well, the kind of offence that's been committed against the particular victim. One of the questions you ask yourself is, why is this victim a victim? And why would this person be victimised in this location by this offender? So the condition of the crime scene, you've got somebody who is relatively young and African American and female and so on, and you build up a picture and you think, okay, what kind of person would commit this kind of offence? So, for example, with the Yorkshire Ripper, it was prostitutes and women who might, because of the circumstances, have been taken to be prostitutes. These were the people that were being attacked, and they were being attacked all over Yorkshire. From the condition of the crime scenes, you were dealing with a really seriously disturbed offender who had a modus operandi which involved smacking people in the head with a pinball hammer and then causing them many other injuries. And it turned out that Sutcliffe, who got caught, was a lorry driver. And when you looked at the distribution of the body, admittedly, once you knew that he was a psychopath and a lorry driver, it suddenly made sense that where these offences were taking place, they had to be the kind of offences that the kind of places he could access. So if you look at, take for example, right, the body has been really badly mutilated, and the body has been chopped to pieces or whatever. That indicates a particular type of offender, and it indicates somebody who is either personally motivated or completely deranged. A person just wants you dead. So violent crime that's related to offending gang type behaviour. You've seen all the mafia movies. It's only business. Don't take it personally. It's only business. That kind of crime scene speaks to instrumental killing. If you kill somebody in a very straightforward, clean way, if you like, then it tells the person who's looking at the crime scene something about the kind of person who would have done this, what their motive was, and so on. So look at the crime scene and work out. African American kids are being killed in America out of all proportion to their numbers in the age group. Same thing's happening in the UK. 7 times more likely to be the victim. Black kids in the UK, 7 times more likely to be the victim of a violent offence, a serious violent offence in London, and 8 times more likely to be caught carrying a weapon. So these kinds of things tell you. Postcodes in London. Postcodes offences in London are a massive thing. This drill music, which has effectively been banned, often focuses on postcode taunting and so on. So if you look at the crime scene, you can probably work out kids that are being killed by machetes in London are being killed as part of gang violence typically. So you can look at the crime scene and work out the kind of offender you're looking for based on the kind of characteristics that people who do this kind of thing have. So this is an attempt to establish a psychological type based on the crime scene. Then we've got the British view, David Cantor. Now, he's the person that has got quite a lot of contempt for a lot of the American stuff. And his approach, which is not absolutely categorically distinct from the American, but it is meaningfully distinct. It's got a very different emphasis. He was asked by the police to help on a series of rapes and murders in London in the mid-80s. He had previously been involved, we'll watch a video on it, he'd previously been involved in market research regarding biscuits and how do you make a biscuit that people like and how do you place biscuits so you can sell them. So Cantor essentially starts from the assumption that criminals are often rational or sufficiently rational to commit offences and come to the attention of the police late rather than early. So he said, let's actually look at where the crimes are committed. Let's look at the order in which, if you've got an offender that's done 6 things, as long as you're reasonably sure it's the same offender that's committed all the offences, which can sometimes be quite difficult because you have to link the offences, but as long as you can be reasonably sure that it's the same offender that's committed the offences, you can reasonably assume that they committed their first offence nearer home than the others. That doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect pattern, but usually what happens is the first offence is going to involve a real psychological hurdle. So they want to be able to flee to their home. So they're more likely to do it nearer their home. Then, because they want to avoid being detected and they want to avoid witnesses, they'll tend to move further away. So the railway killers were using the railway system and they were moving further away, so there was that pattern. Most offenders are so-called marauders. They maraud out and away from where they live. They like to be home quickly. It's a very deep psychological need to get back to your burrow, to get back to your own bit, as it were. So you apply these basic psychological principles about human motivation. So, for example, people who are going to be really violent towards other human beings have often been violent towards animals. They start off with hurting animals. That's a classic sociopathic thing. Someone who has got a job where they have to work office hours is probably not going to be able to commit offences or some offences during those hours. So if all the offences are committed at weekends or in the evenings, it tells you something about what's likely to be true of the person who's committing the offences. So the British approach is much more about let's treat the offender as at the very least minimally rational, and they move through the urban environment in a way that's predictable, given what they're trying to achieve, which is offending without being caught. So Cantor he ultimately created a program called something like Dragnet, and it allows police forces to chuck in loads and loads of information about the offence, particularly the timing and the location and the sequence, and it will then predict where the offender is likely to be found. So he produced this profile, and the cops prioritised these two, John Duffy and David Mulcahy. And they were caught, they were observed, arrested, charged, convicted. Now, it was an uncannily accurate profile. I mean, he did an absolutely brilliant job. You'll hear Cantor talking about it. One of the detectives investigating said that we actually thought you had, when we looked at your profile and you told us about the location, we already had the kind of inky finger of suspicion in these guys, and we kind of thought that you must have known as well, because it was so accurate, we thought you knew. So the profile didn't prove that Duffy was the attacker. Cantor didn't give evidence in court to prove that Duffy was the attacker, but it meant that instead of having thousands of suspects, they had a handful and they could be watched. There were a series of serious sexual assaults in the West End and there were arrests made in the college, in the old Langside College, in the old building. The cops came in and dragged a couple of guys out of a class. Now, the cops, I'd seen a guy who fitted the profile, and I contacted them to say I'd seen him on a mountain bike in the area, and he was uncannily good of the description. Now, I don't know if it was, I think it was maybe a day after that or 2 days after that, but one thing I did notice as I was walking up Belmont Street, and there was two guys sitting in a car with the classic anorak on over the suit. I think I saw others as well, but that was the CID. What they'd done was they'd basically worked out where the offenders had to be given the offences, and they were going to just sit in the cars and just basically watch the street for hours and see if anybody walks the streets who looks as if they might be the kind of person they're looking for. It was that obvious. Once you know that there's a whole series of sexual assaults taking place, a group of males from one particular ethnic group are attacking people in an area in a given time frame, it doesn't take the brains of an archbishop to think they're probably living somewhere near here, they are probably going for a drink, they are probably going to buy fast food, they are probably out and about more often than they commit the offences. So let's actually just watch, and if we spot them, we'll follow them back to their bed set, and we'll get the address and we'll get the names without letting them know, and then we'll find out if we've got a reasonable reason to knock on the door, like an outstanding warrant, for example. And at that point, you're in a position to start taking DNA and asking people where they were at particular moments in time. So if there's an offender in the area, the cops can use that very fact to just simply try to find the offender by watching who's in the area. Now, of course, these days, in a place like China, the BBC did a little study. They allowed the Chinese allowed them 7 minutes to escape from a police station and then see how long it took them to catch them. So they left the police station and then headed off as fast as they could. And the Chinese state used its facial recognition software, cameras, and other devices to see how long it took to catch them. I think it was seconds. I think so these days that kind of stuff is very, very powerful. Once you've got an area where you think a person might be found. So take for example height. Height is very hard to fake, particularly making yourself shorter. You might be able to wear left heels, but you wouldn't want to walk about crouched the whole time. So if you've got a tall offender and you've got software that allows you to accurately measure the height of people in relation to, for example, telegraph poles or street furniture, it's awfully easy to set up a camera so that anyone over 6'3" gets their picture taken. So that which raises big privacy issues.